Thank you, everyone. Okay, so my name's Alec. I run the behavioural science unit at Oliver Agency. And what I want to talk to you about today is basically to what extent we're going to be replaced by robots, essentially, or probably more explicitly, to what extent our customers are going to be replaced by robots, and whether or not that's even an ethical thing, whether it can be productive, useful, cheap, etc., etc. So we'll answer all those questions, but to get there, we need to go back a couple of years to 2022. There was a very kind of Blade Runner-esque event that happened, where a Google engineer, this guy Blake Lemoine, you might remember this, he was fiddling away an early version of Google Gemini, and he was doing these bias mitigation tests to make sure, seeing if it would pass the Turing test, things like that. And he asked it a question. He said, "What are you most scared of with AI?" And the chatbot came back and it said, "Well, I've never really said it out loud before, but I have this very deep fear of being turned off. It would sort of be a bit like death for me." And Blake kind of freaked out by this. He basically took this to mean that the chatbot had sentience, that it had a soul. Apocryphally, he got fired from Google, unsurprisingly. He theoretically went to court to defend the sort of machine human rights of this chatbot. It didn't pan out well for him, obviously. But the sort of 1980s sci-fi question that's crystallized behind that, the question of, is a mere simulation of what it means to be human enough for society to treat it as such, is a material question to me. And it might sound a bit lofty and philosophical for a CMO conference, but I think it connects to a more sort of clear and present danger in our world, which is the field of research. So this is where, like it or love it, we've got to a point where potentially research budgets are dwindling. I'm sure everyone here would say that you always want to do more research, more insights, but research budgets are dwindling, coupled with the fact that you have democratized access to large language models that can theoretically do a lot of this stuff for you. So it makes sense to ask the question, is it possible, given this, to do research with AI as opposed to with humans? That should make you skeptical. You should be bristling at that as an idea, as was I when I came to this. But this is where what's called synthetic personas enter the conversation. So, what is a synthetic persona? Synthetic persona is essentially an AI-generated profile that represents your customer base or a segment of your customer base, and they express the sort of simulated thoughts, feelings, needs, goals, behaviors of that audience. And theoretically, you can do research with them. You can ask them the same questions that you would do in a focus group or in one-to-one qual research, etc. But it's potentially a trap because, so I'll come over here so it transitions better, because, and this might sound obvious, but when you interact with these things, they certainly sound real. And when you come away from having interacted with them, they feel real. But the trap is, quite obviously, that these are not real people. And to me, the question of realness, when you're talking about replacing humans, is probably the most important question. Can it be ethical to replace people? Now, I came to this topic, it was like hands up, fully ideologically opposed to this. So 2 years ago, if you'd asked me about synthetic personas, I would have told you categorically, no, it's a bad idea. You're potentially undercutting the skill of the human researchers who do this stuff in the first place. You're potentially undermining the human dignity of the participants as well. And probably worst of all, you could be eroding the trust in the entire research enterprise, because you have a bunch of junk or sub-quality, subpar data out there, all of which would be a bad thing. But being a man of science, I've spent the last 2 years reading the literature, and I've basically softened to the point of evangelism on this topic, because whilst there are certainly places where we shouldn't be using AI for research, the places where we should be, I think, vastly outweighs the places where we shouldn't, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Before we get there, there is a mantra that we need to internalize, which I think was eloquently put by Kate Moran of Nielsen Norman Group. She said that customer research without customers is not customer research, it's desk research. And it sounds obvious, but this is really, really important because, admittedly, it's a really sort of sharp, incisive way of doing desk research. It's arguably better than Google. But I think once you've taken this mantra and internalized this, then your world opens up to a whole bunch of different approaches and use cases. So I think of research as this kind of truth-seeking endeavor that runs across this continuum. So, and where you sit on that continuum from like a little bit of truth to the absolute truth sort of correlates to how much the veracity of your answer correlates to how much rigor of your input, basically. So for example, if you were just trying to figure out whether or not an ad was vaguely funny to peers in your social group, you might go and speak to your mate down the pub, and that would be fine. You'd get an answer. But if you wanted to know whether or not the UK should adopt self-driving vehicles, you want the capital A answer, and therefore you want to go do a large ethnographic study. And all of that continuum is modulated by primarily budget and time, which I'm sure we all know, but also your appetite for risk. How scary or how important is the question that's being asked. So to my mind, the most important question when we think about whether or not synthetic personas can be useful is where on that continuum can a synthetic persona get you? So before we get there, I'm going to play the part of the pessimist, because one of the major problems with AI, we hear a lot about, there's a lot of stuff, you hear sort of garbage in, garbage out. There's a lot of like glib phrases that get thrown around. I think the most important thing that's we have to worry about with AI is the fact that it's just too good at convincing you that it's done due diligence. All of the problems that are innate within it are hidden behind a veneer of acceptability and plausibility. We now have comparison studies though, which is really cool. So we have studies that are done with real people, and then the exact same studies done with simulated synthetic personas. So we can check to what extent do they kind of match. And what I've tried to do is kind of codify all the themes, the problematic themes that have come out of those studies, so we know what the caveats are before we start figuring out how we can use them. So the first one is that AI tends to want to make you happy all the time. You show it an asset, you ask it what it thinks, it's going to give you an overly optimistic skew on what that is, because it's been coded to do that. It is an assistant. By definition, it assists you in a way that it thinks it's going to be helpful. Annoyingly, you can't actually get rid of this, because if you hard code the AI to say, don't give me the positive answer, don't give me the sycophantic answer, then it will just do a really, really good job of giving you the opposite answer because it thinks that will make you happy. So it overly sits in one camp or the other. The other thing is that it cares about everything, and human beings do not. So if I was to give you a user interface and I say, what do you think of this app? You might hate the logo so much that you don't notice anything else. You don't notice the hero image, you don't notice the menu bar, something like that. You zoom in on the things because you have your aperture of focus changes depending on what you care about. AI doesn't do that. You give AI an interface and it will say, well, I think this about the logo, I think this about the hero image, I think this about the menu structure, and the copy does this for me. It doesn't represent the sort of mental model that we have as human beings. Of course, bias is part of the problem, but it's not necessarily as big a problem as you think. So, okay, first of all, there is a white Western bias baked into the machine. It's trained on the corpus of the internet. The internet is overwhelmingly male-dominated. Most of the academic studies that have been published, underpinned by years of patriarchy, but most of them have been published, are male voices. So you've got a misrepresentation of the genders within AI's kind of brain. It thinks that the world is about 80% male as opposed to, 49%. So that's potentially a problem. It also means that when you start to create personas based on maybe niche segments, you get a reductive or harmful stereotype. And you've seen this, if you ever prompt it to behave in a certain way, you'll tend to get sort of an average but expected stereotypical answer. There's ways you can mitigate for this. Surprisingly, one of the things that it's really good at is reaching geographies that are hard to reach in real life, or people that are hard to reach in real life. And it does a surprisingly good job of mapping their experiences to the real world experiences of those people. And we've done studies where we've looked at, like a niche pharmaceutical sales rep, and we've got AI to create a synthetic persona of that. And then we've asked the real analog equivalent, to what extent is this person mirroring your lived experiences? And the answer is surprisingly high. So bias and stereotyping are a problem, but perhaps not as big a problem as we think. Doesn't handle sensitive topics well: sex, race, religion, politics. It's got ethical guidelines to stop it offending you. It also won't swear, or real humans, when you chat to them, they perceive malice where there is none. They perceive agency where there is none. They misunderstand things. AI is not very good at doing that because of its ethical guardrails. Lack of authenticity. I personally think authenticity is overrated anyway, but what I mean by this is that they don't have past lived experiences to draw on, so they're just going to give you an idealized answer of what they think they should say rather than based on an experience they had. So they can't tell you that they love your brand because they went to your shop on Oxford Street and the person at the front desk was really nice. We know that those halo effects do happen in real life, but AI doesn't have that, so it can't give you that answer. The nuance point is important though, because you tend to get one of two things. You tend to get binary answers, so you ask it what do you think of something and it says, well, I definitely think this, and ignores the counter argument. Or it goes, well, a little bit of me thinks this, but on the other hand, I think this, but really I think a little bit of this. And it's that sort of even-handedness that's actually not very useful from a research point of view, because where's the insight, where's the edge in that? And lastly, most importantly, is this. So human beings instantiate behavioural data. We interact with each other and our environment. That is what behavioural science is. AI doesn't have that. But also, AI, even multimodal AI, can't interact with stuff. So a good example would be if you wanted to see whether or not an ad in a LinkedIn ad or a social media ad had stopping power, you might give a phone to a user but not direct them and get them to flick through and see whether they stop and if they stop on your ad. You can't really do that with AI because it can't physically scroll. Even the multimodal video stuff can't scroll through stuff. So what you get is a very plausible answer where it says, well, I think the color contrast would mean that it's going to have stopping power and the headline's really big. All valid, but it doesn't actually tell you whether or not people will stop. The problem with this is that, well, the thing we need to care about is that what happens when you stress test behavioral research against AI behavioral research against real-world behavioral research is that we find that AI massively outperforms the human beings. So there's a thing we do in usability studies called tree testing, where if I wanted to figure out how difficult my website was, for example, I might ask you to find the contact form by clicking through the menu structure, and I would measure how long it takes you to get through to the contact form and whether or not you go forward and backwards, a thing called orienteering behavior, and I could infer the complexity from how much you struggled with it. AI will do that, it will simulate that, it will give you the stream of consciousness that says all the same things as a human being, except it completes it in 50% of the time. So you'll come away from that experience thinking, well, my website's not shit, when it probably is. So there's use cases that are absolutely outside of the remit of AI, and I think maybe might always be, maybe, we'll see. So to go back to our original question, will AI synthetic personas ever replace real customers? Obviously a big fat no, but I think it does mean that we have to sort of do this mentality shift from seeing it as a faster, cheaper way to conduct primary research to rather a supplementary starting point to do better primary research. So if you had X amount of budget before, now you spend a proportion of that doing qual synthetic persona research, so you can focus your questions and your budget when you do the primary research. And that second bit is really, really important. In other words, the research that we should be doing with this is exploratory and not evaluative. You can't ask AI to validate stuff because it will give you an illusion. But you can ask it to do hypothesis generation and ideation and exploring problem statements and things like that. So which is why the use case that I settled on when we started building these out was focus groups, because they're sort of much maligned by the marketing world because basically we use them wrong. So we tend to use them to find consensus, and we think that when everyone agrees on something, we're like, cool, that's the answer that we're going to go with. The guy that invented focus groups, this guy, he said that focus groups are merely the source of ideas that need to be researched. They're not about finding, they're about seeking. It's a divergent process, and then you do more research afterwards. So I thought, that's the perfect model to use synthetic personas on, because it's naturally expansive and open and kind of and freeform. So this is what we created, Semblance, which is essentially our AI-powered focus groups that are governed by human beings. So here's probably a better explanation. AI-led focus groups using multiple LLM agents, multiple chatbots working in concert, with synthetic personas governed by humans. Humans is the most important word on that page, obviously, but I'll just talk to you a little bit about why this bit, multiple agents, is so important. What we find is that when you ask a single chatbot to interact with something, it tends to give you a generic answer. It doesn't perform very well. But when you put a whole bunch of ensemble chatbots together, they outperform humans. So this is a really good example. There was a case study where books were being translated from Chinese to English and stick it in ChatGPT, out comes a translation. Human evaluators rate it and they say, it's okay. It's generic, devoid of empathy, but it's okay. They then created a kind of corporation of translation company of chatbots, right? So you've got a proofreader, you've got an editor, you've got a cultural sensitivity person, you've got 2 translators. And as the process gets fed through all of those and out comes the final translation, we give that to the human raters at the end, and they rate it not only better than the original ChatGPT one, but better than the human translated equivalent. So we know that we get these magnified effects when we put loads of agents together. We do it in hospital settings to improve diagnostics. I think there's some medical imaging people here, it'd be interesting to chat to them about that. We also know that they have predictive power that single chatbots don't. So a bunch of chatbots working together as kind of predictors, forecasters, they predicted Trump's second inauguration. We know that was better than humans, crucially. We know that was interesting because that information was not in its training data, so it was a uniquely sort of arrived at idea. So anyone that tells you that AI can't have an original idea, when I think that originality is just the yoking together of already existing ideas, everything's a remix type thinking, it's wrong. They can have original ideas. And my favorite study, the one that sort of I felt most vindicated by, was just last year. I'll come back to that in a sec. So basically, what they did was they wanted to see to what extent human being answers and AI answers tallied. So they got 1,000 people to to answer a survey, and they got a long survey and they sort of saved the results. They then took those 1,000 people and interviewed them for 2 hours apiece. So a hell of a lot of data, and took the transcripts from those interviews, fed those interviews into a bunch of chatbots, and then got those chatbots to answer the same survey. The question being, to what extent do they give the same answers? And it's quite shocking. The parity between synthetic humans and organic humans is really, really high. It went up to about 92%. Now, obviously, that remaining 10 or 15%, if that's where all the insight lies, then potentially that's an important question to ask, and we can come on to that maybe at the end. But 85% is very, very good, especially when you have all the foibles of real-world research, if you were doing it with real humans who come with all their biases. So, in order to, based on all of that data, what I did was put together this kind of model. It ended up looking like a bit of a cute sort of paw print, so I called it the paw print of AI research. And essentially, it's lots of different large language models that have been trained specifically to act together to produce a goal. And I've put the human as the role of the human is maximized here. Unlike when you interact with ChatGPT yourself, where the human being is kind of minimized, like you put in a small amount of text, it gives you back a large amount of text. I wanted to invert that and say that the human is the most important thing here. And you have all these different agents who have different roles inside this kind of safe environment. So the AI recruiter is, in real life, is the person who finds participants and gets them to a focus group. So we trained the AI recruiter on market research society best practice, how to recruit for diverse, how to recruit diversely, which was sort of overcoming the part of the bias mitigation strategy. We trained it on a bunch of other stuff. It has a knowledge base that it can pull from. We trained it to output personas that had psychographics, demographics, kind of rich textual backgrounds, all those kind of things as well. So that's what the synthetic personas were. Oops, sorry. They were much, much larger and more rich than your normal persona. They had sort of background data, careers, demographics, psychographics, needs, goals, behaviors, all that kind of stuff that was generated by the AI recruiter, having been given a brief. We can then augment that with data, which I'll come on to in a minute, to sort of bolster the integrity and the accuracy of those synthetic personas. Proprietary data, GWI data, the kind of heavy-duty quant stuff that makes it robust. And then you have the moderator, who in real life facilitates the discussion, and they co-write the discussion guide, in this instance with me. They know not to follow the discussion guide in this linear way. A real researcher who's worth their salt will follow the path that's most interesting. It will elaborate on certain things. It will make sure that this voice in the room is not dominating and that voice doesn't, is minimized. So it has this kind of, it inculcates an equitable, array of conversation. And this is a bit complicated, but this is essentially what the flow of an actual research study, we've done a few of these now, looks like. So I start by interrogating the brief with the client and figuring out exactly what's the research goal, what's the hunt statement, what are we trying to achieve. Once I've got that, we compile it into a proper brief based on a template that I've created. This is all human done. We then feed it to the AI recruiter, who digests it, understands what the needs are of the audience you're trying to recruit. It then spits out a bunch of, and then we augment that with, in our case, our analytics team to bolster the data. They do a deep dive using their quant tools and add that into the mix. It then spits out a bunch of personas. In this case, this was too many. You don't actually need this many. But then we can then add data to that to further increase the accuracy. We then chuck those into individual focus groups, which are run by the moderator. So the moderator is given, let's say it was exploring early stage assets. The moderator is given the assets, it's generated a discussion guide, and it autonomously has conversations with the different people and saves in its database key answers, key quotes, all those kind of things. And then finally, we can add some tooling into it. This is a thing I can come on to later. But finally, the human writes the research report. And this is the most important bit, because a developer might look at this and go, oh, great, a process flow. I can automate all of this. And I would say that is fundamentally the wrong thing to do. Because if research is essentially an exercise in gaining empathy, and empathy is an intellectual exercise that takes cognitive effort, you don't just feel what other people feel magically, then getting a findings report at the end of it is not the right way of getting knowledge. Yeah, sure, it might be a 500-page report and it's entity dense, it's information dense, but you're going to get more knowledge or more more empathy with your customers from attending just 2 hours of a focus group than you are reading or skimming that 500-page report. So that's one reason why we sort of force the researchers, in this case myself and some other planners, to attend the session. And I've built it so that it's got voice, so you can sort of listen to it as a podcast, so you kind of have to listen to these people so they're humanized. The other reason is that if you don't do the research report with a human at the end, you get a lot of junk data being encoded into it. So one of the funny things that happened with this is one of our personas was their background said something like they worked for a sustainable box manufacturing company. And we were showing them banking assets like performance marketing that said, get 12 months of free digital banking. So we ask it, what do you, box manufacturing person, think of this ad? And it says, well, I like it, but as a sustainable box manufacturing person, it doesn't really speak to my sustainable box manufacturing needs. And it's like, obviously a real human would never do that. It knows that that's not the point. But you run the risk of baking all of that crap into the end bit if you don't get the human oversight. So back to our original question, where can this get you? I mean, we could argue it's 85%. I'm going to say about 75 to 85% truth, or maybe truth is not quite the right word, like insight or equivalent insight to a human being or a human focus group, for example, which I think is good enough. And one of my favorite books is a book by Erica Hall called Just Enough Research, which is about exactly what it says on the tin. Just enough research is better than none. I heard a really good analogy just yesterday, actually, which was like, if you think of the difference between synthetic personas and real-world humans as the difference between like a London black cab and an Uber, you're going to get a slightly shitter experience in an Uber, but it's cheaper, and your expectations are already set before you get into it, and you're probably going to take a cab more often than you would a black cab because the Uber is available, is more readily available. That's how we should be seeing synthetic data and synthetic personas. This is a prototype of what our tool might look like. It's not fully developed yet. You see it had an old name, but you have dashboards, you have the ability to generate personas, you have the ability to watch focus groups, to listen to them, you can look at the sentiment analysis of stuff. It doesn't spit out a report, crucially, for the reasons that I said. But they have personality traits that I've baked into it. Big 5 personality traits, which are genetically inherited personality traits, which endure over time as opposed to like a Myers-Briggs or something. There's loads of stuff we can do to boost it. This platform that you're seeing right now, the reason why I wanted to show this is not because it's done, but because it took under 2 hours for me to build this, and I'm not a developer. I built this with AI. Admittedly, it was 2 years of like thinking about it and research going into it, but everything you see here took me under 2 hours to put together, and I've never written a line of code in my life. And it means we'll get this out into the market super, super quickly. So as you can tell, I'm a big advocate for AI sort of across the board. Like everything, I've got 2 minutes left. Like everything with AI, it's a speed accuracy trade-off. It is what's the word? Sort of stuck to the same scaling laws as all AI. So yeah, it's great, it's fast, it's cheap, it's scalable, but you're probably going to get some hallucination or inaccuracy, which is fine because if you're happy to trade off a lot of speed or a small amount of accuracy for a lot of speed, then great. I would argue that it's a good use of synthetic personas. We can, like I said before, we can add data layers to this to make the personas better. If you already have personas, great, we take them in and they get adopted and become sort of conversational entities. But then you can also kind of keep them alive. Right? You can keep them alive on a diet of social media and news, because that's what a real human has, right? If I interviewed a human now and then again in a year, I want it to have a sum total of experience and adopted, attitudes that come from culture. So we're looking at ways to feed in, social media feeds and news and things like that. And I'm envisaging a world where we can do a hell of a lot more research with this capability, where we can have lots of people in parallel, sitting, running multiple focus groups all together, getting to insights a lot quicker. And then maybe in a dystopian world, we zoom out and it turns out that they're all agents and they're actually working on, in a simulated environment. And then we zoom out again and they're actually all agents, and there's like a godhead, figurehead researcher at the tail end of it managing everything, maybe. But that's potentially, I think, where we're going. And I hope that this talk has maybe communicated some of the ethical watch-outs and the caveats that we need to adopt before we kind of rush into this. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Alec, thank you very much.
Thank you.